Thank you very much. I am introducing one of the speakers today, who is a special assistant to President Biden and the coordinator for the Los Angeles Declaration on Migration and Protection. This is Marcela Escobari. Marcela, thank you so much for joining us. And of course, welcoming Ambassador Frank Mora, representative for the United States at the Organization of American States. Thank you. Let's please take a seat. Thank you so much to CAF, and thank you to the Inter-American Dialogue, and thank you to the OAS for inviting us today. When I think back at the last time I was in this room in the last 12 months, I think about the sharp contrast that I have faced in my news coverage. I mean, I was in Medellin covering the Feria de las Flores to bring the story of the culture and the music. I was also doing a profile piece for CBS Sunday Morning on Maluma. During the same week in Colombia, when I got a call that I needed to rush to Ecuador because the presidential candidate, one of the presidential candidates, had been assassinated. That was last August. Over the last year, I have been at the border many times, including when the executive order was handed down. And there, I met groups of people who were crossing the border from Mexico, who were not coming from our region, but from Bangladesh. And just several weeks ago, I was in Venezuela covering the election. When I landed there, I was completely energized by this effervescence of hope. And by now, what I feel is that there has been a suffocation of that same hope. When I think about the people in this room and the ability to effect change, I think about what people that I met in Venezuela who are planning and saving up to cross the border to come to the US because it's the one place where they think that there's some hope. When I think about the people that I've met along the way in countries in the region, what I hear is a desire for quick fixes, quick changes, and messianic leaders. And that's a problem. Polarization and populism are a serious concern in our region, in our hemisphere. And Marcela, I want to start with you because through your work, even before working with the White House, you have dealt with solutions that are not immediate. Let's start talking about immigration because most of what I cover is there. What would you say, as we look into the US election that we're just less than 2 months away from, or 2 months away from, what would you say is the legacy of the Biden administration, and what should people think about if that legacy is continued under a Harris administration? And how does that differ from the previous administration and that legacy?
Well, thank you, Lilia. I think probably the biggest difference and something that has been core to the Biden-Harris administration's strategy is that it saw migration as a regional challenge that required regional solutions, right? The problems that had changed. We had 8 million people that had left one country in Venezuela. This has been the largest displacement in the Western Hemisphere in its history. But also the migration corridor shifted and expanded way beyond Central America and Mexico. But this is not the first time that we have, have seen spikes of migration in our border. And what the Biden-Harris administration did is implemented strategies that have been stress tested through history, but it did it in a very massive way. It increased enforcement, and not only through the EO, but in collaboration with Mexico, Title VIII, to send a very clear message that there will be consequences for people that migrate irregularly, but it also created alternatives for people to migrate safely, legally, and to be able to work here in the US. And I think probably most importantly, it realized that it needed a hemispheric approach. And that's where the LA Declaration comes. Like President Biden 2 years ago, the whole administration, with 21 countries, signed the LA Declaration. And that's basically a really, truly holistic approach to migration. We all have and face different facets of this challenge, but we can only tackle it if we're all rowing in the same direction, and that's what the LA Declaration does. And just to give one example of of kind of the success of that strategy, which I think is going to be its legacy. I mean, the region has legalized and integrated over 4.2 million people in their communities. Every one of these individuals is one less person that has to risk their lives crossing the Darien. It's one more person that gets to restart their lives in their new communities. So I think when you speak about the legacy of this administration, it's going to be an approach to migration that is not rooted on bullying our neighbors or thinking that this problem is just solved at the southwest border, or rooted in fear-mongering. I think it's one that pushed sustainable solutions in a very pragmatic way and in a spirit of partnership.
Well, one thing, and I do want to follow up on that, Marcela, because there is this rhetoric, and the rhetoric goes around the numbers. I mean, last December, we saw record numbers, 250,000 people encountered at the US-Mexico border. And when we think about legacy, what people think about, the Trump administration was border wall, was very harsh or deterrent policies. And fast forward, I mean, I remember covering the border last year and covering the border this year and seeing the impacts, the rapid impacts of the executive order, drop in migration within 1 month, or encounters within 1 month of more than 30%. When people think about that, the first question is, well, why did it take so long? If you could have done that all along, why did it take so long for those limits to access to asylum to be implemented, and what were those concerns?
Look, there is no question that the executive order has had results. It has increased more than 50% in terms of encounters at the border. But that is not an isolated action. There have been actions taken in lockstep with the region in the last few years. And just talking about enforcement, let me give you a couple examples. In the last couple of years, there's been over 300 new changes to visa policies to really clamp down on travel that is intended for irregular migration. I mean, if you take the example of Ecuador, who just imposed visas to PRC nationals, the next month, there were 90% less PRC nationals in our southwest border, right? We have increased our biometric sharing throughout the region, where we can flag and intercept, threats and criminal actors before they enter any of our borders. Like, we've worked in an unprecedented manner with Mexico on enforcement. I just came back from Panama and Colombian trilateral, where they're working together to reduce, movement through the Darien. So I think the EO is part of this broader strategy. And to be honest, this was not a decision that the president took lightly. Like, an EO is not a durable solution. It is fragile on the courts. But we put forth, a solution that would have required legislative action to really solve a broken asylum system. But when Congress didn't act, the president did.
The kind of collaboration, the kind of transnational, regional, hemispheric collaboration that you're talking about requires dialogue, requires people being able to speak and countries to speak with each other. And Ambassador Mora, I'm so disheartened, to be quite honest, brutally honest, when I come back from the places that I cover, when I go on social media and I see the comments, the way that people cannot even begin to dialogue. People are on one side, and if they are on the right side, they don't talk to the left side, and vice versa. And that's not just people using social media, that is leaders. I was in the flight when there were all these former presidents trying to go to Venezuela to observe an election, and were kicked out, and we almost didn't get to Venezuela because of that. And we come back and we see that there are, at the OAS, conflicts when it comes to acknowledging something that, to everybody, I think, here watching can acknowledge was not a democratic process. And so I wonder, what are the challenges to solutions that require so many different countries to come together and leadership to come together, and how do you defeat the level of polarization that prevents even conversation?
So thank you, Lilia. Can everybody hear me, or?
I think the mic is, there it is.
There we go. Good morning, everybody. you put your finger on it, I think, Lilia, because on the one hand, the complex challenges that we face, and we can't think of democratic erosion in and of itself, or migration, or poverty and inequality, or insecurity. These are all connected, right? They sort of reinforce themselves in a very negative way. And those kinds of challenges requires a kind of collaboration that perhaps we haven't seen before. And it is difficult in a polarized environment to get people to collaborate. And that's where the OAS, I think, comes in. Because the OAS, first and foremost, provides a space, a forum for, one, political dialogue, for people to understand what the challenges are and where they're coming from. And I think it's a start. It's not sufficient. It's not the end, right? The OAS is not going to provide the solution to everything, but it creates a space. And these challenges, because of their complexity and their transnational nature, requires, as Marcela was talking about in terms of migration, requires a multinational, transnational response. If we're going to, no single nation or single organization can say, we're going to tackle this problem on our own, you're going to fail. And you're going to fail miserably. So it is important that we try to overcome this problem that you said, polarization, political polarization. And you see it in every forum, you see it in every place. And until we're able to address this issue of polarization, until we're able to take seriously the challenges we face, transnational crime will take advantage of that. We'll take advantage of our own weaknesses, our unwillingness to collaborate, the lack of political will. And so it is pivotal, first and foremost, that we take advantage of forums like this to create dialogue, collaboration, and cooperation that would hopefully then seep into the region in ways that will address the complexities of these problems.
I like to learn with examples, with anecdotes. I know that there have been efforts, incremental shifts in achieving great successes whose stories are hard to tell because it's not in a headline, and we consume information, unfortunately, nowadays in headlines and snippets. And Marcela, I wonder, what is one of those successes? What has been either an effective policy or a victory that you can quantify that people haven't really heard about, that we haven't covered enough?
Okay, I really think
in multilateral collaboration.
No, I think I mentioned it, but I think the story that has not been told enough is the story of what the region is doing when it comes to legalizing and regularizing migrants. Like, when it comes to migration policy, like, we know what the answers are. This is not, brain surgery. It's like, we know that regularizing, legalizing migrants is like better for the migrants, it's better for crime, it's better for the economy. It is just politically complicated because, weaponizing migration is the oldest trick in the book. So despite that reality that has always made this policy issue really hard, in the region, we've had like remarkable good policy and remarkable brave leadership, to be honest. Those 4.2 million people that have been legalized and regularized, that's like over half of the countries that have signed the LA Declaration have active regularization policies, and they're currently implementing it. Right? It started with Colombia with their 10-year temporary protective status to over 2 million Venezuelans. But Ecuador last month just announced a new regularization process for 200,000 migrants. Brazil has, with its interiorization policy, has matched 500,000 migrants to labor needs throughout the country. Peru, in the midst of the COVID crisis, it validated degrees of 500 different healthcare professions so that Venezuelans could go be on the front lines of the COVID response. These are incredible stories. I mean, you have seen them on the ground. I've had the privilege to talk to folks who want to come out of the shadows, want to contribute to their economies. And every time a government does one of these policies and we are able to show their success, it makes it easier for the next government leader. And I'm not saying we're done with this. This is incredibly difficult in this country and elsewhere, but the progress and the life's change is undeniable. And I think we do have the potential for this hemisphere to be an example for the world of how to manage massive displacement in a way that's helpful to migrants, but also absolutely helpful to our economies.
And among the topics that we're really diving into today is insecurity, is democratic governance, the root causes, the reasons why people are forced to leave the places where they're from. And Frank, I wonder if there are examples, if there are perhaps anecdotes or similar cases that you think of where, look, diplomacy is very slow, but that provide the kind of either structure or hope to see that these problems are not just going to accelerate, and we don't need to constantly just catastrophize, but you can undo the insecurity and restore democracy.
So one of the
Yep.
So one of the challenges, and then Rebecca mentioned this in her opening remarks, if you just look at the issue of democratic erosion in the region, which is a significant challenge that affects transnational crime, corruption, et cetera. I think the OAS, if you just use the example of Guatemala, for example, I mean, the President Arevalo came to this hall and gave a speech and was very clear in saying, you all, the OAS, played a fundamental role in me arriving and being inaugurated in January of this year. We did a lot of, we met 14, 15 times, passed a series of resolutions. Diplomacy worked. Diplomatic pressure worked. Others were involved, of course, but one should not underestimate the role of the OAS and how central it is, the issue of democracy and human rights. That we talk about it all the time. We have a critical instrument known as the Inter-American Democratic Charter, that we're constantly thinking about ways in which we can work. The Secretary General speaks to this issue all the time. And now Venezuela, right? We've had several meetings on Venezuela. We've continued to put diplomatic pressure, but we're part of a multi-front effort to make sure that the will of the Venezuelan people is not dismissed or subverted. And we should and must continue that pressure in Venezuela. And particularly in light of not just the subversion of the public will, but the brutality that's come after it, and the repression and the abuse of human rights. And that should be front and center for the OAS, for the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and for different organizations and forums and specific governments who are involved in doing this. But what we can't do, whether it was Guatemala, whether it's in Nicaragua, or in Venezuela, we should not abandon the Nicaraguan people. We should not abandon the Venezuelan people. Like we did not abandon the Guatemalan people. We should continue playing that role because it has, Lilia, an impact. It demonstrates how important, how relevant, how credible this organization is in addressing, just on this particular issue, the issue of democracy, the issue of elections, particularly in electoral observation, and of course, the incredible work that the Commission on Inter-American Commission on Human Rights does in showing, demonstrating, shining the light, as they've done in the case of Venezuela, for example, recently, about the brutality that we're seeing in that country at the moment.
And Marcela, I'd love for you to follow up on that. And both, if you can provide some of those examples of what did it look like from the White House in terms of Guatemala, and what is happening now? What kind of pressure, other than taking Maduro's plane, is the U.S. exerting?
Look, Frank and I were there in that epic inauguration, but I actually really liked that you brought this up as part of root causes. Right? I mean, this was a fundamental shift when we thought about migration, and when Vice President at the time, Biden, decided and convinced many of its colleagues in Congress that we needed to go tackle insecurity, joblessness, corruption in Central America and the reasons that people migrated. And it was a fundamental change at the time. And then the Vice President took it to a whole new level, not just with the historic commitment of $4 billion of foreign aid, but in bringing FDI, and most importantly, what Frank is talking about. It's really using all of our tools of government in pivotal moments to really tip the scale in favor of democracy. And that's what we saw happening in Guatemala, where, when the Attorney General was, trying to strip immunity of President-elect Arevalo, of the electoral judges, where Congress stood in the way of a peaceful transition, we acted. We sanctioned 100 members of Congress. We brought indigenous communities together to the private sector to, think about how we share these principles of democracy. We rallied our allies from the EU to our allies within the region so that we all spoke in one voice. This was no longer an ideological battle, which it historically had been in Guatemala, right? And we were there with Frank in that inauguration, and maybe symbolically, we were there till the wee hours of the night until President Arevalo was inaugurated. But I think what it shows is, Frank, what you're talking about, but also the willingness of this administration to use all of its tools when it comes to defending democracy. And I think it's really up to us to do the same in this critical moment for Venezuela.
And I'm curious about that because, covering Venezuela, you see the rapid progression of the violence, of the repression, of really the human rights violations. And the fact that just this week, there's that order for arrest for Edmundo González Urrutia. It's unfathomable, the speed at which things are becoming undone. So at which speed is the United States and people who are in this room and those in power to exert pressure, are they exerting that kind of pressure and demanding that the will of the people be respected? And this can go for both.
Yeah, obviously, the way they commit human rights violations is much faster than any response we might have, right? And certainly at the OAS. But the key is, I think, is that the protagonist in this tragedy, really, is the Venezuelan people and the democratic forces within Venezuela. The international community should be supporting them, right? We are part of the solution, but we're not the solution. We are in support of them, right? And so they need to keep sort of the fight and insisting that the will of the people be respected. And so whatever we can do at the OAS, whatever the United States can do at other states to continue that, to ensure that the Venezuelan people feel, oh, that's it, we're tired. Let's move into the next crisis. We must not abandon them. We must continue to insist. Because I think Maduro is counting on one thing, which is what happened in the past. That the international community kind of says, okay, we did what we can and gave up. We must not give up. And I think with respect to the OAS, I think from the perspective of the United States, we're going to continue insisting that the OAS keep its eye very closely and following developments in that country.
And from the White House?
Look, we all share the incredible frustration, but I think it's helpful to look where we are now and what we could have been, right? When 2 years ago, when I joined the administration, the Venezuelan people had given up on the possibility of electoral change, and there has been a dramatic change in terms of people really rallying behind change within Guatemala, within Venezuela, and as Frank was saying, like, let's look at the different scenarios that could have been, right? It could have been that we didn't have an election, that we didn't have a process, and yet we had a primaries process with 3 million people often risking their lives to go and vote. We had a united opposition in Venezuela. And we had and the other alternative could have been either no election or an election where it would have been easy for Maduro to cheat, right? It was so overwhelming that he had to resort to blatant fraud to claim victory. And now all eyes, and this is what we in the White House, the OAS, and everybody in the room is doing, is for the world to come together and shrink that space for Maduro to have less options in trying to continue this fraud.
Very quickly, we're out of time, but if anybody has a question, there's a microphone back there. We have time for one question. Maybe we have time for it, perhaps not even. But Anybody raising their hands? Any question for the panelists? Well, if we don't, I think we are, no? You're just scratching your face. All right. I want to thank you both so much for your work, for your openness in discussing. And if anybody has questions, I think you're going to be around in the room, correct?
Thank you.
Thank you, Lydia.
Thank you all. Thank you for your time.